Chapter 3. Exile Without Expulsion, History in the Twilight Zone. When Heinrich Graetz came to describe the fall of the Second Temple in his book History of the Jews, he began by comparing it with the destruction of the First Temple. Once more did Zion sit weeping amid the ruins, weeping over her sons fallen in battle, over her daughters sold into slavery or abandoned to the savage soldiery of Rome, but she was more desolate now than in the days of her first captivity, for hushed was the voice of the prophet, who once foretold the end of her widowhood and her mourning. The historical story was thus fashioned on the biblical model of the destruction, as was the deportation that followed. This first proto-Zionist historian proceeded to narrate the tragedy in an agonized tone. It would indeed be difficult to describe the suffering of those who were taken captive in the war, estimated to number 900,000. Youths under the age of 16 and most of the female captives were sold into slavery at an incredibly low price, for the market was glutted. Graetz naturally borrowed the narrative about the end of the Zealot revolt from Josephus, and further inflated his numbers. He even added information lacking in the original, highlighting the sacred pairing of destruction and exile. These calamities came with such crushing force on the remaining Jews that they felt utterly at a loss as to what they should do. Judea was depopulated. The third banishment, the Roman exile, Galut Edom, under Vespasian and Titus, had commenced amid greater terror and cruelty than the Babylonian exile under Nebuchadnezzar. Only a few were spared. What was to be the future of the Jewish nation, of Judaism? He answers these menacing rhetorical questions in the negative. The nation of Judah would survive, and so would its religion, or else Graetz would not have been able to write his fine book. Moreover, unlike the fall of the First Temple, this one left a remnant of the people clinging to its homeland. This enables the historian to continue the pathos-filled narrative about the Jewish people in its land. But already at this stage he creates an indirect meta-image of uprooting and wandering. This is reinforced in his description of the consequences of the Bar Kokhba revolt that broke out 65 years later. Thus all the warriors were destroyed, all the towns and villages laid waste, and the land literally converted into a desert. The prisoners, mostly women and children, were dragged by the thousands to the slave markets of Hebron and Gaza, where they were sold. Many fugitives, however, fled to Arabia, whence that country obtained its Jewish population, which afterward played so important a part in its history. Note that nowhere does Graetz speak of the whole people being exiled. He stresses the captivity, and the flight of many from Judea. Very skillfully, in the literary genre of tragedy, he interweaves and links the two historical uprisings into a single national sequence. The repeated comparison with the fall of the First Temple, with consequences familiar to most of his readers, rounds off the picture. Simon Dubnow also makes no mention of deportation. Moreover, unlike Graetz, the Russian Jewish historian avoids associating too closely the destruction of Jerusalem with a forcible mass deportation. He follows the literary examples of Josephus and Graetz in describing the fall in dramatic and shocking terms. Thousands of captives are carried away to the ends of the empire, leaving Judea thinly populated. A similar description follows the end of the Bar Kokhba revolt. A great number of captives are sold into slavery, and an equal number of rebels become fugitives. But Dubnow does not create a meta-image of the Jewish people going into exile after the destruction of the temple, and it is clear to readers that the people was not forcibly uprooted from its country. Salo Baron employs a similar rhetoric. The New York historian does not link the destruction with a deportation, but, as we shall see, tends rather to highlight other reasons for the presence of Jews outside Judea. He lingers on the tragic consequences of the two uprisings, but is more meticulous in stressing the end of Judean statehood. This is not depicted as a drama but rather as a lengthy, logical historical process. To Baron, the most significant issue, and one related to the subject of the previous chapter, is to avoid a connection between the end of Judea as a political entity and the disappearance of the Jewish ethnic nation. He confronts the historical analysis of Theodor Mommsen, Julius Wellhausen and other Gentile historians who described Jewish communities after the fall of Jerusalem as religious groups rather than as one people, by asserting that from the time of Nebuchadnezzar to modern times, there has been a distinctive Jewish ethnos, which never completely fitted into the general patterns of national divisions. The Jews, then, are a people with an extraordinary past unlike any other people. We find, as we proceed to typical Zionist historiography, that the essence of the discourse does not change. Neither, surprisingly, did the Zionist historians describe an expulsion following the destruction of the temple. But here we find a different chronological surprise. The historian Yitzhak Beer's well-known book Elut begins by describing the meaning of the long exile. The destruction of the Second Temple widened the breach in the nation's historical continuity, and augments the treasury of national religious jewels whose loss is to be mourned, the temple and its cult, the mutilated theocracy, the national autonomy, the holy soil ever further from reclamation. For Beer, the ground is slowly slipping from under the people's feet, but the Jewish nation is not torn from it in a single violent act, even though its kingdom has been lost for a long time. Life on the national soil goes on, despite the massive destruction, and so does the heroic struggle. The struggles of the zealots for political freedom and the firm establishment of God's supremacy continued from the time of Bar Kokhba's revolt up to the conquest of Palestine by the Arabs. Only after stubborn resistance was the lesson learned, that love cannot be prematurely aroused, that the kingdom of God cannot be set up by force, that one cannot rise in rebellion against overlordship of the nations. Beer was a painstaking and thoughtful historian. He not only knew the mass of sources about the fall of the Second Temple but was also familiar with the abundant materials of medieval Judaism. But if there was no expulsion, it was still necessary to have a forced exile, otherwise it would be impossible to understand the organic history of the wandering Jewish people, which for some reason never hastened to return to its homeland. The start of the exile without expulsion was different from the exile that Jewish tradition mistakenly dated to the fall of the temple in the 1st century CE. The long exile was in fact considerably shorter, because it began only with the Arab conquest. This exile without expulsion, which began in the 7th century CE, that is, some 6 centuries after the fall of the Second Temple, was not Yitzhak Beer's invention alone. This astonishing discovery was made by other Zionist scholars as well, notably Beer's friend and historiographical comrade-in-arms, Ben-Zion Dinur. The first volume of his famous collection of sources, Israel in Exile, first published in the 1920s, later acquired a subtitle, From the Conquest of the Land of Israel by the Arabs to the Crusades. Aware that he had to prepare his readers for a new national historical sequence, Dinur prefaced the sources with a long exposition on his novel chronology. I begin the period of Israel in exile with the conquest of the land of Israel by the Arabs. Until that time, the history of Israel was mainly that of the Jewish nation in its homeland. It is not necessary to explain that the true exile, in relation to the nation, as a mass historical entity, not its individual members, began only when the land of Israel ceased to be a land of Jews, because others arrived, settled in it permanently and claimed it for generations. True, tradition and popular perception do not distinguish between our people's loss of power over the country, and the loss of the land from under its feet. But from the historical viewpoint it is necessary to distinguish between these two situations. They were not contemporaneous, and are historically distinctive. The chronological revision is significant and decisive, and may well be seen as undermining Jewish tradition. It seems to have originated from two linked causes. 1. The basic requirements of professional historiography prevented the first two Zionist historians from asserting that the Jewish people had been expelled after the fall of the Second Temple. 2. The urge to reduce the time in exile to a minimum so as to maximize the national proprietary claim over the country. This consideration also prompted Dino to date the beginning of the rebellion against exile and the early zephyrs of modern Aliyah to the immigration of Judah Yehezkel and his companions in 1700. The way the Roman Empire gradually reduced the political power of the Kingdom of Judea was important, but not as important as the historical development that actually led to the exile. The invasion of the country by desert dwellers in the 7th century, and their seizure of Jewish-owned lands, changed the country's demographic character. Emperor Hadrian's decrees had, of course, expropriated lands in the 2nd century, but the arrival of the Muslims greatly accelerated the process and eventually led to the emigration of the Jews and the creation of a new national majority in the country. Until that time, the Jews had constituted the majority of the population, and Hebrew was still the dominant language. The arrival of the new settler-conquerors altered the country's cultural morphology and put an end to the presence of the Jewish people in its land. It is true that there was no deliberate policy of expulsion, but that does not mean that exile was undertaken voluntarily, God forbid. Dino was worried that if it were accepted that the Jews left their country of their own volition, it would undermine their renewed claim to it in modern times. He struggled with this grave issue for years, and ultimately reached a more satisfactory historical summary. Every Jewish habitation in the diaspora began with exile, that is, as an outcome of compulsion and force. This does not mean that the Jews came to most of these countries after the fall of Jerusalem as prisoners of war, fugitives or deportees. The road from the devastated Jerusalem to their final settlement in any given generation was extended and protracted, with numerous sojourns along the way lasting a long time. But because they arrived as fugitives seeking shelter, and as the fall of their country was famous and its circumstances were known to all, it was natural that people in the countries to which these fugitives came were satisfied with knowing the original circumstances which had led them thither. Sometimes the Jews themselves sought to stress the Jewish aspect of their exile, by playing down their connection with their previous place of exile and stressing the first, or primary, cause. Thus, even if the exile following the destruction of the Second Temple was a vague myth, it was justified, because it was followed by other expulsions and wanderings. The long exile is like a shadow cast by the destruction, hence its chief significance, to encompass all future exiles. Dino willingly accepted the Christian, and subsequently anti-Semitic, myth about the wandering Jew who finds no rest. He therefore defined the Jewish identity not as belonging to a religious minority that lived for centuries among other, dominant religious cultures, sometimes repressive and at other times protective, but as the identifying profile of an alien ethnic national body that has always been on the move and is destined to keep wandering. Only this conception of exile gave an organic sequence to the history of Jewish dispersal, and only in this way could it clarify and justify the return of the nation to its birthplace. Dino gave the secularization of the Jewish exile its strongest and clearest historical expression. It was essentially revolutionary, and altered not only the Jewish time structure of the exile but also the underlying significance of this religious time. The historian felt its national power vis-à-vis the declining tradition, and although he repeatedly resorted to it, he also turned it inside out. As a historian and public intellectual, he replaced thousands of rabbis, those organic intellectuals of the Jewish past, who defined Judaism itself through the concept of exile. He therefore did not scruple to issue a new halakhic decision. The 3 vows of Rabbi Yossi ben Honina were vows to preserve the exile. They were revoked by the end of the exile, and the vow not to rise up over the wall is likewise null and void. This generation's only answer must be indeed to rise up over the wall. This bold historian, who became Israel's Minister of Education in 1951, assumed that the power relations between Judaism and Zionism in the state permitted him to pronounce the end of the exile. And he was right. The nationalization of religion in Israel was advancing rapidly, and he could claim ideological victory. To round off the description of how the concepts of expulsion and exile were transformed in Zionist historiography in the new homeland, we might consider briefly two more scholars who dealt directly with this issue and contributed much to the development of national consciousness and collective memory in the flourishing Israeli society. Joseph Klausner of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, who was in effect the first important historian of the period of the Second Temple, and his colleague Yehezkel Kaufmann, author of the important work Galav Nikar, Exile and Estrangement. Both received the Israel Prize. It was Klausner who wrote The History of the Second Temple, a work in 5 volumes that was reprinted many times and read by countless readers. The final volume concludes with the events of the Great Revolt, and the renowned scholar lavishes praise on the fighters and their national courage. Having described the tragic end of the siege of Masada, he closes with the following words. Thus ended the great uprising and the most glorious war for liberty in antiquity. The fall of the Second Temple was complete. No self-rule, not even internal autonomy worthy of the name, remained in Judea. Enslavement, corpses, ruins, such were the sights wherein the second destruction was revealed in all its horror. That is the historical summary, and nothing further is said. Even this very nationalistic historian, with his right-wing orientation, did not dare to add expulsion to the destruction of the Second Temple, and thus to his book's highly dramatic ending. He knew perfectly well that such a description clashed with the fact that 60 years later another mass uprising broke out within the extensive Judean population that had not been exiled and that, moreover, was led by a hero like Bar Kokhba and the heroic warriors of Betar. Therefore he, too, like other Zionist historians, preferred to keep the beginning of the exile in the historiographic Twilight Zone. Similarly, Kaufmann's Exile and Estrangement contains a great deal on exile and nation but nothing about expulsion. This book is one of the most intriguing attempts to ascribe the Jews' long exile to their being a stubborn, resistant nation rather than simply religious communities. But his meticulous analysis of the Jewish exile avoids touching on the historical circumstances that gave rise to this weird, strange and scattered community that remained, as he saw it, a people, through all the circumstances and adversities. Now and then he speaks of Israel, that was exiled from its country and scattered, but the text does not spell out when this happened, how, why, and to where Israel scattered. The origin of the exile is taken as known, requiring no detailed explication, despite the book's subtitle, A Socio-Historical Study on the Issue of the Fate of the Nation of Israel from Ancient Times Until the Present. The action of expulsion, such a central and fundamental event in the history of the Jewish people, should have been studied in scores of investigations, yet, amazingly, it has not resulted in a single such work. The historical reality of the expulsion was thus accepted as self-evident, not discussed and never doubted. Every historian knew that the myth combining destruction and expulsion was very much alive in the mind of the public, having derived from religious tradition and become firmly rooted in secular consciousness. In the popular discourse, as in the political statements and the educational system, the expulsion of the people of Israel after the fall of the kingdom was carved in stone. Most intelligent scholars evaded this dubious area with professional elegance. Here and there, as though unwittingly, they supplemented their writings with alternative explanations of the prolonged exile.